So next we have another wonderful speaker who will be talking about the pathway to adulthood in ASD. Dr. David Nicholas is a registered social worker and professor in the Faculty of Social Work at the University of Calgary, Central and Northern Alberta region. He is the author of over 120 peer-reviewed research publications with a focus on well-being and quality of life in social services. He has been a PI, principal investigator, on major grant funding from international, national, and provincial sources. Dr. Nicholas has focused his research in areas of systems development and organizational practices in the aim of offering better outcomes for youth and adults with developmental disabilities and their families. Please join me in welcoming Dr. David Nicholas. How do I...
Thank you. It's a privilege to be here, and I must say that introduction missed probably the most important part, which is I have a personal relationship with autism as a parent, and so my family have taught me many important things. As I suspect, we could go around the room for those in the room who are living with autism and or have someone who they love who has autism, and the many lessons of life that have been taught and are experienced along that journey. Our colleague, we're going to hear from Dr. Heather Brown later today, and Dr. Brown has taught me an important word. I knew the word, but I hadn't mapped it to autism like Dr. Brown has. So where is Heather? Okay, and the word is thrive. How to thrive with autism. And that's really what I want to talk about a little bit in the context of the pathway to adulthood and into the notion of employment in adulthood. So Dr. Zwagenbaum talked briefly about some of his work in the area of diagnosis and young children. But we know that autism is lived mostly in adulthood. Right? That's where we spend, given a normal lifespan, where we spend the majority of our time, of our life's journey. And yet, interestingly, that's probably where we have put the least amount of our conversation or our attention to research, at least until recent years. There's been much more. And I'm encouraged to see that happen and to see the conversation shift to notions of thriving in adulthood. Doesn't that sound good? And it raises questions about how can we be the most vibrant, welcoming, dynamic community for people with autism to live and thrive? What would make your community be that community? And this picture on the screen, we're going to come back to it. I want you to notice it. It's a path. As we think about the path to adulthood, moving to employment and quality of life. So what I want to talk about specifically, a few objectives, and we'll kind of veer along the pathway if that's okay, if we have a bit of a narrative here, but to explore areas of adults with autism and research in terms of the development of that research and specifically suggested priorities for moving forward with the focus on employment, if I may. So here's this picture of this pathway. I would argue, I don't know if you'd agree, but this pathway was not always there. This is a bit of an upward slope, maybe a hill, could be a hill in our community, that somewhere along the way, someone has created a path there that didn't always exist. So they moved some rocks. There may have been some rocks that were naturally there. We see some over on the left side that maybe were moved or were adjusted a little bit, so there would be some semblance of a pathway forward to help someone navigate their movement along the upward slope. And if we think about that upward slope as our pathway across the life journey. And the question then becomes, how do we nurture a path that, in Dr. Brown's word, people can thrive? What would that look like? So what would be potentially the steps along the way? What would be the barriers that would need to be overcome? And we know in autism there are many barriers, right? We don't want to gloss over those. And what I want to suggest is this is in a way, and what our research has really taken us to is an ecosystem of autism. We could argue that a lot of attention is put into helping individuals in their functioning in daily life through intervention, and that's a good thing. Helping them navigate, and we talk about the importance of early intervention. And we talk about intervention along the life course. What do we need to get to people so that they can thrive? But I want to broaden our thinking to this path, which is really that it is not only about working towards adjustment of that individual, but can we broaden that to create, how do we broaden the ecosystem, the environment, the community of interacting organisms, or the context in which people live and hopefully thrive so that it works better for them? So that's about individual support, certainly, but what else needs to happen in your environment for you to work well? Do you need to belong to a supportive community? Somebody's nodding yes. I would say so. Do you need resources at your disposal? So we could go on and on about what do we need in our ecosystem. And I wonder if we have paid enough attention to what the individual needs in their ecosystem to move forward. And I want to use the example of employment. So here is a path that is hewn with rocks and crevices and barriers. And I actually wonder if that traditionally has somewhat been the path in the employment journey for people with autism. That the barriers have been so formidable that the path has been strewn with issues and challenges and glitches and stigma and all kinds of challenges that have made that path impassable. Maybe more like this path. Look at this one, where the barriers are just so intense. So let's look at the stats to get a sense of that in terms of the example of employment. So from the US, Dr. Paul Shattuck suggests that a year after high school entry, over 58% of youth are not in either employment or post-secondary education. So high school ends, and where do people go from there? What comes next? The story gets better over time, which suggests that people with autism may need more time to navigate. But I wonder if we were to hew a more welcoming ecosystem in terms of the resources to employment, those stats could be much better. So by 1 to 2 years, 51% are neither in employment or post-secondary education. So that's over half, 1 to 2 years. But if you look down the numbers, 4 to 7 years after high school exit, 11% are either not in post-secondary education or employment. So I wonder if the message there is there's a longer rampway to employment or post-secondary for folks on the spectrum. But I wonder if we can change those stats. If we look at Canada, 22% of working age adults with autism are employed. 22%. Then you calculate that, how many are unemployed? So that path is hewn with barriers. That's what I want to suggest. And I wonder if we can do better. And I think we can as we look at what is out there. So this busy slide introduces some interesting opportunities for us. And these are some examples from the literature, but we have examples here in our own city of some terrific, I think, initiatives that we can build on. So the first one here is called the TEACH program. And that comes out of North Carolina. It's training and job coaching in situ, which really means in the environment. So people are learning, they're getting education about what it is to successfully be employed within the environment of the employment itself. So they're learning cognitively, but they're also learning experientially. So they're being able to immediately apply those skills, generalize them in the environment. And that is one of the challenges, is can we teach skills related to employment, both the hard skills of what to do in the job, but also the soft skills. So much of what we do, and this is the challenge, is when we're in employment, much of it isn't about our job. It's about the soft skills, the relational stuff, the complex politics and the dynamics of that workplace that make it so challenging. So can we learn that in situ? That's what the TEACH program gives. And look at the results. Over 10 years, 96% placement in jobs. Job retention rate of 89%. Pretty good, eh? Much better than the stats would indicate. Second example is called Project Search. And that also is an American example. Comes from, there's a group both in Cincinnati and in Virginia who have really brought leadership to this program, but it's all over, including in Canada, sites in Canada. But the point of it is an internship program for youth in the final year of high school. So, we haven't talked much about co-op type programs and internships and linking employment training that is focused on the strengths and the challenges for someone on the autism spectrum, and weaving that within the longer rampway of preparing for adulthood and going on into adulthood. So Project Search really is focused on that, preparing for adulthood. Are we actually reaching the potential in those latter years of high school to bridge people to success in where they're spending the majority of their time in adulthood, and in this example, in employment? Or could I stretch it a little bit? We talk about, for years we've been talking about getting a job in autism, and I wonder if we should be talking about finding one's career or finding one's calling. When I think about that notion of thriving, what does that mean in terms of finding one's niche? If you think about what you love, what is your niche? And how do we translate that into an employable skill? Sometimes that takes some amazing ingenuity and thought, and maybe recasting how we think about the potential and opportunities and challenges that someone faces. So that is Project Search. Happens in high school, but with an internship in the workplace. So again, it's that working, learning, and trialing, and learning and trialing. Now let me take a poll, if I may, for a moment. How many of you started in the job that you ended up in? Anyone? I don't see a single hand in the room. And I wonder if folks on the autism spectrum are given enough opportunity to try and see what works and what doesn't work, and know that if it doesn't work, that's not the end of the story. That's just one more thing to check off that might not be the option to try. And if we think about that in terms of, let's not let the employment challenges, both as people are preparing, but also as people are in the workplace, escalate the anxiety to the point that people stop being in the employment market. Dr. Jen Zwicker differentiates not being employed versus not even being in the market, thinking about, could I work? And I wonder if there is a malaise and discouragement that can happen as people are facing the barriers in the ecosystem that just become too much to bear. And can we do better? Not so much the individual, sure, we got to give them support and resources, but rather as a community, as an broader ecosystem, to change the discussion to one of, we're getting closer to that point of getting to a position that fits for that individual. And having the resources within that context. And they might be resources like mental health, or adequate housing, or you name it. I mean, it could be people in one's life, recreational things that can help us discombobulate after a stressful day on the job. All those things need to be part of that ecosystem that we're talking about. That sound all right so far? So let's keep going to the third example. So this is from the UK. So I've kind of initially drawn on examples from outside of Canada and that have literature in terms of outcomes. So you see there, Project Search has very good outcomes in terms of employment access. In the UK, the National Autistic Society NAS Prospects Program. So that is a supported employment model in the community. And that's probably more akin to the kind of models that we tend to embark in our region and in Canada, which are support within the community and working with employers. So 68% in 192 jobs over an 8-year period. So long-term data collection with employer capacity building. And I don't want you to miss that, because remember that notion of ecosystem? So the work of supporting people to lives of thriving in employment are not just about supporting that individual to work, but rather, in this case, supporting the employer to create an environment that works for everyone, including that individual with autism. That's ecosystem development. The NES Prospects? The question was, do they have this program in Canada? I want to talk a little bit about some programs in Canada. So one example in Canada is Employment Works, for instance. And that's a program that is in this city and in other cities. And it reflects a federally funded program out of the Worktopia initiative. So people can look that up. And with really promising outcomes. And that reflects a model of ecosystem. So the individual is given supports and preparedness, but so too is support to the employer in terms of building understanding and creating an employment option that works well. So let me give you an example. What is the pathway to get into employment? How did you get into your employment? Did you start with you created a resume maybe, or filled out an application, and then did you have an interview? Has anybody here, let's have a show of hands, who has had an interview to get a job? Looks to me like virtually 100%. Now think about someone with autism. You're in an artificial environment that depends entirely on a hypothetical social environment with a stranger that is based on social reciprocity and filled with hypothetical examples, like what would you do if, or what are your strengths and challenges, very abstract notions. For some, do you think that could be a barrier to presenting your best self in terms of your ability to actually do the work that's required of that job? And I wonder if we need to think about pathways into employment that really speak to what one can do in the job versus how one can verbalize that in that artificial social reciprocal environment that may not be the best way to convey one's strengths and skills. And I'm encouraged because as we work with the ecosystem of the employers, I've heard more and more people say, why do we do that? That actually might not be the best way to represent. And I'm thinking, yeah, maybe not. And could we do that differently so someone could demonstrate their affinity and their strengths and their fit for a job in a way that doesn't demand that front load way of perhaps blocking the path. Remember the rocks and crevices in the path? That could be one. How do we start to remove those rocks and crevices? Yeah, so the point that's just been raised is, what if your social skills is the challenge, but they're testing for that? I think that we need to ask, that's a great question. We need to ask those tough questions, like, are those skills, is that a requisite for doing well in that particular job? And what is the best fit? How do we think about fit of jobs? So what I'm inviting us to do is think more critically. And I think that's where there is some tremendous hope to think about the pathway to career for individuals with autism. All right, so what are some of the challenges? We can talk further in the break. I know time and our discussion, but So I would welcome your thoughts and questions, and as we rethink about what would it take to make Edmonton or your community, wherever you're from, the most welcoming community for people with autism to live and thrive. So one of the challenges in the literature, there is not a huge amount of literature in this area, although I would say a growing amount of literature and a growing amount of Canadian literature, which is terrific. Some of the gaps that emerge as people have reviewed some of that work are the skills that individuals, that youth and young adults, but maybe older adults learn in terms of pre-employment skills, core skills, resume writing, interviewing, some of those soft skills, the occupational focus, motivation, are lacking. So people aren't given perhaps enough direction of where their pathway could lead them to thrive in employment or to grow in that area. And we focused on, and some understandably so, in the immediate of what we have to get through in terms of functional skills for today. But I wonder if we can think about what we need now, but also what we need long term, and think long and plan accordingly. And then the other thing that we haven't paid much attention to is job retention. So there's been a lot of focus on what do we need to do to get someone into work, but think about what do we do when the hurdles come? And how do we navigate that and support that well? And here's some examples. Social reciprocity, some of that water cooler talk that happens in the workplace. How do you navigate that? And that's a challenge. Navigation of work environment. So what if the sensory spaces of the place don't work? How do we deal with that? And more, the question of accommodations are being addressed, and I'm glad for that. But we've got a long way to go there. The demands, the relationships. People talk about the challenge of to disclose autism or not, or when to, and what does that mean in terms of getting a job, in terms of getting accommodations, etc. And what if someone has autism and is an adult but doesn't have a diagnosis? So there is another challenge is that has probably been under-addressed in the literature, and the focus on these early days of how do we get someone a job is rather thinking about the rampway into employment being a long rampway, not so much at age 18 or when people are leaving school saying, oh, what do we do next? But rather thinking about, let's plan that early. And also, let's have an off runway from the end of high school that isn't a panic, but actually is a longer term plan, that people may need longer term supports as they move into employment. And so it's not just about getting a job, but rather supporting people to face the hiccups in the employment journey along the way. But realize that that doesn't mean it's the end of the road. That rather, that's a way to maybe recalibrate and move forward. And so to acquire those early engagement and think about a wider employment sampling, that giving people opportunity in some of those internships really is about giving people early opportunity for a variety of exposure to jobs. And so allowing people to find things that don't work, maybe not, hopefully not, but realize that in finding things that don't work, help us get closer to what may work. And I wonder if we pay enough attention to that along the journey. And then some of the promising elements that are being introduced in the literature that I think invite further look, but also really have some important early data. Things like the use of technology. So video modeling, audio visual things, PDAs, reminders, things that can help people function, manage sort of the executive functioning in the workplace. And technology can be our friend in some of that. And I wonder if we're leveraging that to the extent that we need to. And behavioral supports or approaches that allow people to navigate some of the complexities in the workplace that I'm not sure that we have leveraged to the point that we could. Now, so when we think about employment or career, one of the things that we have talked about is how do we increase access? How do we encourage engagement? So we think we need to think about all of these things, and each of these require intervention or careful thought. And I would challenge us to think not just about support to the individual, but the broader ecosystem. We need to think about retention in a job, not just about getting a job, which is largely where our research has gone in its earlier years. But how do we keep jobs, and also advancement? Now, advancement is a complex notion because some people may not want to shift. That changing may be challenging. And also some people, if they are in a position that they thrive in, say it's, if we use an example of it's data management, they do really well, and people go, you could be the supervisor. And yet the supervisory role requires a whole different set of skills that may not fit as well. And we've seen examples in the literature of people that have been propelled to take other jobs that don't fit who they are as well. So we need to think about that. On the other side of it, people may get dissatisfied or bored in jobs, and people may pigeonhole them into a position. And so we need to think carefully about, what does shift and advancement mean? Remember, our goal is thriving. So what's part of that ecosystem that we're talking about? Certainly individual support. And I think one of the things that this calls for is better and more long-term and more targeted evidence-informed supports for individuals on the spectrum. So job preparedness, job skills, life skills. So managing life within the stressful thing called a job. Job access and fit of the job, but also job retention and advancement. As well, we need to think about the community and the workplace capacity. So the organization and the employer. So how do we build understanding among employers? And I think that's where there's been some important work gone on in terms of engaging employers, helping them understand some of the elements of autism without being overly focused as one size fits all. I think we have to be careful there. But importantly, understand workplace adjustments and the importance of sensory fit and environmental an environment that is conducive to someone to thrive. And challenges that can happen, and how do we manage those, again, without it being the end of the job? Is there a way to anticipate the challenges may come and say, I remember an example where there was some work done and the employer said, yeah, we knew there would be challenges, but that doesn't mean it's the end of the job. We just manage that and move forward. And I thought, what a different conversation than someone saying, this isn't working, we're going to have to end this employment relationship. Thirdly, family navigation and support. And I think that in children, we talk a lot about families. We talk about family-centered care and all those important notions. As people move into adulthood, they may or may not have their family integrally involved, and that may shift over the course of a lifespan. But I would argue often behind the successful employment, particularly in past generations, there was often a family member who was lingering in the shadows, who was doing some important work. And often unrecognized work. And the culture of employment often does not include engagement of families. And so I think we need to think about, how do we figure that one out and support families, honoring the family's role, celebrating that. And this is a shout out to the families in the room for your amazing tenacity to just move forward and to create opportunities to thrive. Don't you give up. Things can happen in ways, particularly as we think about moving our ecosystems forward. But also for families, particularly as parents age, augmenting and easing the family role. So it is not the default for families. Can we do a better job in terms of our community systems and structures? And lastly, community resources. That needs to be part of our infrastructure. So what is service availability for adults? What are some of the barriers and the disincentives to work or to thrive in work? Information navigation can be a real challenge, and a particular challenge as people get older in terms of not only fewer potentially services, but also more challenges knowing where to go to get what one needs. So where do you go if the mental health challenges become overwhelming? What do you do about that? And as an adult, And how do they interface with issues of developmental disability and mental health? That's one example. What about housing? This, we need to think about a policy framework and a community resource structure that works for people to thrive. So it's not just about the individual and getting them a job, right? It's about creating a structure within and around that works for you and I. And I would argue it's about quality of life. I'd be interested in Dr. Brown's thoughts on this in terms of thriving. I have loved a notion of quality of life that's come from a group out of Toronto. It's called Being, Belonging, and Becoming. And the being is, and I think about this for yourself or for someone you love or care about, being who you want to be, belonging, being in a welcoming environment, and citizenship. And I mean real citizenship. It's about being in your community and having a space of welcoming and feeling a part of your community in a way that is generative, in which you can be who you are and thrive. And lastly, becoming. The pursuit of aims. And Raphael describes that as the degree to which a person enjoys the possibilities of her or his life. May it be, as we think about creating that opportunity for people in your community. So as I close, I just want to kind of put out there, we're using the example of employment here. We could use many other examples, but getting a job, as we've talked about, and as the literature and the research has talked about, I think we're moving beyond that. It's not just getting a job. Rather, getting a job isn't creating a meaning, is creating a meaningful career, but a job is an important part. So it's not just a career. That's my point, our career is part of it, but it's not just getting a job, and it's just not finding a meaningful career, which really is about finding a set of activities in one's work life and daily life that matters to them and that is meaningful to them. Rather, getting a job or creating a career actually may not be the pinnacle. So some people have almost evangelistically said, we've got to get people to work. That's the answer. And I wonder actually if that may be part of it in terms of a meaningful pathway through life. But if that is not the pinnacle, and rather quality of life can be enriched by meaningful employment. And that's why we pay attention to this. Meaningful and sustained employment reflects a supportive ecosystem. That's what our argument has been here. I'd be interested if you agree with that and what it would take to create that meaningful ecosystem in your life or in the lives of others in our community with autism. And finally, that is about creating together a good life that involves belonging meaningfully in our community. And I think that's where I'll stop in terms of thinking about the pathway into adulthood and into employment. Thank you.